I'm Liam Kelly from the Institute of Asian Studies, and I am here speaking with Victor T. King, Professor of Borneo Studies at the Institute of Asian Studies, Universiti Brunei Darussalam, and we are talking about tourism and heritage. Okay, Victor, thank you for taking some time to talk.
Pleasure.
So, tourism and heritage, that's a big topic, and you have been working on this for many years. I guess a great way to start would be if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how you got into this and what attracted you to it.
Yes. Well, I mean, my background is in cultural anthropology, so tourism in Southeast Asia is so important in that particular field. But in a way, I think it's been a sideline for me. In that, and now I'm contemplating on a lot of my research recently, going back to the 1970s when I was working in Borneo and then subsequently in Malaysia, and thinking that a lot of research was never really planned. It was by chance, coincidence, the sudden funding opportunity that is available and so on. And those are the kinds of things I think that sort of influenced me and the particular direction which I took in my research. So the same in tourism studies. As I say, it was something of a sideline. I took over in the UK in the Centre for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hull as professor there in the late 80s. And it was my task to try and pull this multidisciplinary unit together. And we were developing links with Malaysian universities. We were sending our students to Penang, to the University of Science Malaysia there. And I happened to be visiting to see how the program was going. This was in about 1990. Wandering along a beach in Penang, Batu Ferringhi, with an economist colleague of mine. And I was saying to him, John, what should we be doing in multidisciplinary research and so on? And there we were, wandering along Batu Ferringhi and so on. We'd taken a couple of days out from visiting the university, and we came to the conclusion, well, why not tourism? I mean, here we are in what was then, you know, a pretty major developing tourist site in Southeast Asia, and Malaysia was developing its tourism industry. And then we kind of sat down at breakfast the next morning and sort of worked out a scheme. And then by chance, funding became available in the early 1990s. We put on a major conference in the north of England. A major edited book came out of that, which I suppose in a way made our name in tourism studies. It was widely cited, still is. Routledge published it. They only did a print run of about 2,000 copies, I think it was. We were convinced it was going to sell more than that, and that they should take it out and they should produce it in paperback. For whatever reason, they didn't, and so it went out of print. And 25 years later, Routledge has just got in touch with us and said they're going to reprint the book in a library series. So that was really the start of it, the 1991 conference, where we got a lot of big names together in the tourism studies field. And then 92, there was the Borneo Research Council conference in Sabah. And I thought, why not put a couple of panels on tourism in Borneo? And it was tough. There was very little research going on at that time. Not just in Borneo, but more widely in Southeast Asia. So there were kind of enormous gaps and opportunities for research at that time. So that's how I got into it.
Now that you explain it, I mean, I can see that you're actually, in many ways, were ahead of the times, because when I think of tourism in Southeast Asia, I mean, obviously there's stuff been going on for a long time, but it's the budget airlines in the 90s that really, you know, led to a growth in tourism. But it's interesting that you were getting into this in the late 80s, because I think that's exactly when UNESCO was starting to designate certain sites in Southeast Asia as heritage sites. Is that right?
Yeah, the first sites were inscribed in 1991.
Oh, okay.
And the first country in Southeast Asia that had signed the convention, the UNESCO Convention on World Heritage, was the Philippines in 1985. Okay. And then subsequently, the major players in the tourism field came into this. Right. But of course not the mainland Southeast Asian countries. They were just emerging, of course, into the marketplace as it were then. Myanmar much later still, but the former Indo-Chinese countries, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam were just sort of opening up at that time. But when we were looking at what we wanted to do, not just a multidisciplinary program of research, but also a comparative one, was to look at various countries which had a fairly established tourism industry. So we compared Thailand with Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia. Those were our four major interests at that time. The Philippines to some extent, but even then, given the political and economic problems in the Philippines, you know, in the 70s and 80s and so on, its tourism industry suffered rather and declined. Even now, in comparison with some other parts of Southeast Asia, it is not that substantial tourism industry.
Right.
It's pretty large, but not as large as Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia.
So you used the word marketplace and talked about how, you know, the mainland states, with the exception of Thailand, were a little late to enter the marketplace. Yeah. Marketplace is a great term, I think, because, you know, you point out in your work that when UNESCO designates the site as a World Heritage Site, that there's money involved in this, but there's a lot more involved. And one of the things I found interesting in reading your work is that you look at the way that economics of tourism intersects with national myth creating and you know, national histories, and how, you know, in some contexts, like Malaysia in particular, this can be complex because the heritage site maybe doesn't quite match the national narrative. And could you, you know, speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, our interest in heritage came a little bit later. I mean, we were looking at let's say mainstream kinds of tourism, including cultural tourism, ecotourism as well. But then towards the end of the 90s, it became clear then, as more of these World Heritage Sites were inscribed in Southeast Asia, that this was an area of some interest, and it would clearly be a major attraction for tourists. So around about early 2000, I think, 2001, we organised a conference on heritage tourism in Southeast Asia, and then published a special issue of a journal in 2003, and then a co-edited book in 2010. And 2009, 2013, we managed to get a fairly substantial grant from the British Academy to do, again, a multidisciplinary comparative project across 7 countries in Southeast Asia.
Oh, wow, okay.
And in fact, at that time, there were only 7 countries that had World Heritage Sites. I mean, Myanmar hadn't come onto the scene then. Singapore had not signed the convention.
I see.
Neither had Brunei. So 3 countries did not have at that time World Heritage Sites. So we did this major comparative project, and as you just pointed out, I mean, we were looking at the economics of this. How do you protect and conserve heritage? You know, unique legacies of humanity, if you like, and also encourage tourism, because this is really what national governments were interested in as well. I mean, it's a vehicle for economic growth, and particularly in certain areas of the nation state where it's perhaps difficult to get other kinds of regional development going, and so tourism is attractive in that sense. But then, as I said, as you said, the whole thing is complicated because of the national dimension. Right. To get a World Heritage Site is of enormous national prestige, and it raises your international profile. Right. And it also builds into, in some cases more than others, your national identity and you know, your nation building efforts and so on. Yeah, I think one of the major places, and this is where I did my some of my field research, was in Malacca in Malaysia. And there, of course, Malacca was, in a sense, the the kind of origin of Malaya and the Malay
right.
states, the center of Islam, of Muslim culture, of Malay culture, of the Malay language, and it's spread out from there to major parts of the island world of Southeast Asia. But with the Portuguese occupation, 1511 onwards, the evidence of the Malay Sultanate, the Muslim Malay Sultanate, were in effect destroyed, removed. Then when Malacca, of course, got its World Heritage inscription, and that was not until 2008, the Malaysian government, because of the importance of Malacca in Malay, Muslim, wider Malaysian history, focused very much on kind of resurrecting that early history. So it was very interesting, the number of museums in Malacca, many of them celebrating Malay, Muslim, Malaysian history, so on. And also the reconstruction of the Astana, the palace of the early sultans of Malacca, which of course had been destroyed by the Portuguese and so on. So there was a substantial reconstruction and building of Malacca to ensure that it had its proper place in Malaysian history. So that I think came about partly because of its inscription as a World Heritage Site. It enabled this, and it raised the profile of Malacca in the context of Malaysia and the wider Southeast Asia and the wider world. And it attracts enormous numbers of visitors now. Recent figures were something like 16 million visitor arrivals in 1 year in Malacca. Now that doesn't apply just to the historic core. I mean, it's Malacca State which receives those visitors, but the majority of them will go to the core area where the museums are, Malacca Hill and so on, which is really the center of the old Malacca. So yes, that's.